All right, guys, part two, the masterclass on the Karashi paradox. Part one, we covered a little bit about the Karashi. We're talking about the Megabass Karashi, standard Karashi in BFS fishing. And then also recently, as of January of 2026, it hit Japan, but it recently hit in North America last month, is the Karashi 80. The Karashi 80. Big differences in sizes, right? Capitalizing on that mid-range, right? Definitely BFS bait. A lot of people don't consider this to be a BFS style because of the millimeter length that it is, hence 80 millimeters. However, you can still use both of these in the same presentations. But we're primarily talking about how the Karashi in the masterclass is transformed. So go back and watch part one if you haven't seen that. If you're catching this video, this is part two. We'll cover a little bit from part one, a little bit, but overall, what we're talking about really is what's been going on in bass fishing really the last couple years. And there's been a pretty much a consistent fallacy of that small baits don't catch big bass, which is absolutely false. Most seasoned BFS anglers understand that the BFS presentations definitely attract big largemouth and smallmouth bass. And really, a lot of BFS guys catch a ton of spotted bass utilizing the BFS. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the older fish, catch and released fish that have been caught maybe multiple times over their life, they're beginning to ignore what I would call the tournament baits, okay, the chatter baits, the bigger baits, the noise and the signal. We'll do the masterclass video on noise and signal for crankbaits in terms of that and how bass are conditioned to those certain noises now, and therefore they are looking for other baits that don't threaten them. They don't feel threatened in the water column, okay? And BFS is certainly an approach that fits that bill because they're not threatened by those presentations like, say, a big giant swim bait or a loud chatter bait or a Chapo or something like that they've seen and heard in their water column over and over and over. So by downsizing, you're offering a presentation that's not associated with danger. Okay, so the fish don't feel threatened by baits this size. Again, this is a Megabass Karashi. There are others in the BFS from like Duo, baits like that in Japan, JDM baits, because JDM has really been undergoing that transformation of fishing and style of fishing. It is a technical style of fishing for the last decade that really is still kind of in its infancy in the United States. So you're going to start to see a lot more smaller baits, say at ICAST 2026, than you probably have in previous years because this is what's happening in Japan, okay? And you've got to understand catching some of these fish on these BFS baits is absolutely crazy in terms of just enjoyment, okay? When you catch a 5-pounder on a 46 to a 60 millimeter BFS bait, it's a lot different than catching a 5-pounder on a 5 to a 8-inch swim bait, okay? The leverage is different. The catch is completely different. So just keep that in mind. So part two, we're going to talk about, it's kind of more of a technical field guide in part two than part one in terms of how to strategically apply BFS, okay? For those of you who don't know, BFS is the bait finesse system, okay? That's what the BFS stands for. But I just like to think about it as downsizing my baits. That's BFS to me. Going smaller, lighter line, light rod, fast tip rod. Okay, that's to me, that's what it means. But it is a system, and you'll see all the reels and all the rods that are going to be marketed in the next 5 years dedicated to baits like this. Okay, it's a niche, and that's what happens in the industry, is they fill a niche with specific rods, specific reels, specific baits, specific line for BFS coming, things like that. So strategic angling requires a calculated transition for high impact power fishing, which is what BFS has become, which is interesting because you've got finesse in the BFS label, yet you can actually power fish these baits, it's just kind of ironic, right? Most people don't think about it like that. Depending upon the environmental variables of fish behavior dictate a more nuanced approach. So that's really what BFS is, it's a nuanced approach. And guys, this is just a video form. If you really want to get the in-depth thing on the masterclass, you want to subscribe to the newsletter. Okay, it's free. Okay, it's on Substack. It's under Smallmouth, army.substack.com. More in-depth infographics, graphics of the baits, graphics of the presentations, techniques, where and when to throw BFS, all those things in graphic form. So if you're more of a reader, I'm more of a writer than I am, a YouTuber or video person. I love to write, and so there's a lot more in-depth information in the newsletter. So be sure to subscribe to that. And I'm basically taking this from the newsletter. So if you're reading it, if you follow along in the masterclass videos on this channel, and you have the newsletter open, you can follow right along, and it basically will come at you. And it'll be the same presentations at the expos, okay? So it's going to be really interesting. So BFS is merely not a small fish tactic, okay? It's not merely like a tactic for, catching small fish. Most people don't want to go out and catch small fish, right? But that's the mentality of a micro fish, micro bait mentality, is they don't catch, and that's not, and that's absolutely false. Okay, it's a fallacy. It has a high conversion rate, okay, for fish of all sizes, especially when larger fish are lethargic or they feel threatened by other baits, especially in the ecosystem. By downsizing the presentation, you maintain a mechanical advantage of bait casting equipment. Okay, that's probably the number one complaint a lot of times with bigger swim baits is it just feels kind of like the bait's controlling you, especially if you're a beginner to swim baits. It just feels kind of, don't get that feeling with BFS baits, okay? An operator can maintain high catch rates even when bass are fixated on forage as small as 1 inch. So remember that. All the bait fish in your river or your lake or your pond or whatever have a life cycle as well. So when everybody spawns, like when the bluegills spawn, right? All the fish are, all the fish are smaller in the spring, early in the spring, right? Depending on when that life cycle happens for each individual species. So this is going to mirror a dominant number of bait fish in most specific fisheries at a given time than, say, a 7-inch swim bait, right? I mean, you got to really be a big-time predator, like, bass, to go after a 7-inch swim bait. It happens. Places in Texas, all the time. Yeah. But the bait fish are often in those fisheries so much bigger and get bigger, and the species of bait fish are different than probably your local reservoir, your lake, your pond, or even your river system. And so it doesn't really translate a lot of times. A lot of things in Texas don't translate to other parts of the country. But BFS translates everywhere. So you can catch a 5-pounder, a 7-pounder. Yes, they've caught 10-pound OHIV bass on Karashi. Go watch Tactical Bassin videos for them as well. They show big bass being caught on Karashis and BFS baits. So just really interesting to think about that. Because you can adjust everything. You can adjust your gear. You can adjust so many things when you're fishing BFS that you can't really do with a swim bait. Okay? You need a heavier line. You need a bigger rod. You need a reel, powerful reel to be throwing big-time swim baits. You don't need that, okay, with BFS baits and the Karashi, okay? Successful BFS operators begin with a rigorous analysis of light, presentation, and water stability, okay? The pace of play is dictated by visual environment. When you go out to the river and you see what's happening, you're seeing the minnows, you're seeing all that stuff. I was just out the other day. Abundance of small, inch or less size minnows, bait fish, smallie fry, from the spawn, bass, okay, largemouth bass in your river systems, your tidal systems, okay, that have spawned because the water temperatures have hit like 60 to 65 and they're spawning. Well, all that's in the river system for all kinds of fish species to feed on. That's just what happens. And so when you look at what we call the environmental trigger matrix, okay, the trigger matrix, what's going to trigger a bass, right? And different times of the year, or even different times within a specific season. For example, pre-spawn. So during pre-spawn staging, okay, buck males, they move shallow to the banks. We know that. Large females, they hold a deeper timber or structure or suspend and hold, waiting to come up to the banks for spawning, right? So what's the tactical response during pre-spawn? The tactical response is the cover water with something like a Karashi 80, a little bit bigger water. You can use like A-rigs, okay? A-rigs is another thing. Paddle tail swim baits, you know, those kinds of things during the pre-spawn are really effective. Target the timber and intercept, okay? You want to intercept the staging females. So not all the females move up at once, right? And so they transition from being suspended or being aligned with timber or rock or boulders or all that stuff in your river. And then they join the bucks, okay? They join the males up on the bank, okay? You can get them in that transition period during the pre-spawn, okay? Let's go post-spawn. The funk, right, is what everybody likes to call the post-spawn. Okay, post-spawn, lethargic selective behavior, okay? Fish are fixated on micro forage. Why are they fixated on micro forage, guys? They're fixated on micro forage, okay, because it's abundance of it in the fishery after the spawn for multiple species, okay? And they're also lethargic in recovery. It's a recovery transition after the spawn, and they're going to transition back, okay, for the rest of spring before we get to the summer. They've utilized a lot of their energy, okay, for the spawn. The males have, maybe guarding fry. The females have actually giving birth, okay, and going through that process. Okay, so they're less likely to chase big baits. They're less likely to go on these runs, okay? They're going to want the easy meal, the easy forage to replenish, you know, lack of a better word, the carbs, right? We're the same way, okay? After we've done something that's been exhausting, we go for water, then we go for food, right, to replenish, right? It's the same kind of thing. So what you want to do with your BFS baits, like the Karashi, is you're matching that hatch, that sub 3 inch. In the spring, that 3 inch is really like that, you know? So for me, I'm not throwing more than like a 3.3 Kitech, okay? I'm really not going to 3.5, 4.2, all the way up for soft plastics, okay? I'm not, even Finesse. I'm going to smaller tubes if I want to run the tube. I'm going to smaller profile jigs, and I'm going to BF style baits, okay? Because that's the profile that's dominant in almost every fishery by May, okay? High sun. Let's talk about high sun slit calm. Okay, a lot of people talk about high sun slit calm. Fish retreat to overhead cover during these conditions. Okay, high visibility increases predatory awareness. Okay, they understand instinctively that they're threatened when there's high visibility. Okay, especially in clear water. That's why clear water bass are pretty tough to catch. Okay, because they inspect every single thing they eat. And they can see it from further away, and the closer they get to it, they can break it down as to whether or not this looks like a natural forage twitching in the water, right? Okay? Muddy water, completely different, okay? So fish retreat to overhead cover, high visibility increases. Transition to slow, bait selection, your tactical response. Slow play. We call it slow play finesse, okay? You're twitching very slowly. You're just using that rod tip a little bit. Doesn't matter whether you're throwing a Karashi, a BFS style hard bait, or you're throwing a tube, or maybe you're throwing a Helgermite. Okay, something finessey. You're doing a slow play. Okay, and you're going to focus on those areas where those bass are utilizing for safety. Maybe a dock, maybe fallen timber in your river. Okay, an eddy is really a safe zone. Bass consider eddies to be safe zones. They're out of the current flow. They're not in the seam. They're not exerting a lot of energy to stay there, and they can pop right out, okay? And then return right back to the eddy after they feed. They're seen as safety, and that's what's happening, like in the spring a lot. Wind surface chop. So when it's windy and you get that chop out there, okay, bass have reduced surface awareness because of that chop. They can't really judge the top of the water column as effective as they can in the calm, right? So that's when they get excited a little bit, okay? Because they really are in that zone of being kind of unaware, okay? And so they get this battle internally on whether or not, you know, to strike or not. This is why bait balls, okay? Bait balls create a lot of activity on the surface, and it attracts and entices bass, right? the A-rig, for example, is basically set to mimic a bait ball, okay? That's when you're going to like decide whether or not you want to put this down or not, okay? And then maybe go to a smaller format jerk bait, okay? Maybe you want to do some other kind of a chopper, some other kind of chopping bait, some other kind of loud surface topwater bait. Could be anything as the old whopper plopper, okay? But you want, because they're top sensitive, that choppiness at the top, okay, has got them kind of like, okay, and so you can go with something else and they can come up and hit something at the top, okay? But you don't have to go full-blown Megabass Vision 110. That size would be more, is different than going with something a little bit smaller, okay? And keeping in the tradition of like BFS style in terms of small jerk baits that are 70 millimeters to 85. That's kind of the sweet spot. Anything above that, anything above 90 millimeters, you're getting into a little bit, different style. Okay. One of the other aspects, which is really, really great for BFS protocols and the Karashi paradox, is the shade line. Shade line protocol. Okay. Constantly you're seeing kind of shade lines, right? As the sun rises, harsh shade lines are created on the banks, depending on the topography, as well as the flow and the position of your river system. Is it flowing north? Is it flowing south, east, west, whatever? Okay, you've got to understand that. Not all rivers are the same. Okay, but as the sun rises, you're looking for shade lines. Okay, typically along the banks, right? Large post-spawn fish utilize these high contrast edges as ambush points. Okay, that shade line is highly effective. Okay. Again, they're in the water, the shade, the sun, they see the difference. They see the difference in what they're seeing, okay, in the gray, all right? The different tone of the gray as they see it. They know that change for them. Dark gray to a lighter gray is the line, okay? What we see, we don't see it in gray. We see the sunlight, and we see the difference in color of the watercolor from maybe a darker color to a lighter color. It looks clearer, okay? So high contrast edges become the ambush points, allowing the silhouette forage against the bright surface before striking, okay? Because the forage obviously reflects with the sun in the top of the water column, and bass are enticed by that. Operators must focus cast specifically within the shadow side of the line. So you want to you want to twitch, okay, from the shallow side of the shade line coming to, okay? And as the transition zone represents the highest probability strike window for better quality fish, is right at that line, okay? So you don't want to drop it right on the line. You want to drop it beyond the line and bring it back to the line, okay? Tactical phase, high energy reaction, okay? High energy reaction, okay? During low light windows, okay? During low light windows of active feeding cycles, okay? High energy reaction bites are utilized to trigger a multi-strike neurological response, right? You know they're feeding up. You can see them popping up everywhere. They're feeding on top water. You can see it from your boat, from your kayak, or even from the bank. You can see what's happening in the water. These disturbances are happening 6, 7, 8, kind of all over a 30, 40 yard radius or whatever. And you know the fish are there because you're seeing it, right? So you know what's happening, all right? You kind of like look at it from like the 1-2, kind of like, okay, this is what happens during this phase. Is kind of like you want to have, and I know not everybody can do this, but if you can do this, it increases your catch rates. Okay, the 2-rod. Okay, it's like a 2-rod 2-punch. Okay, so you've got 2 rods. You've got a Karashi tied on, and you've got a topwater tied on. Maybe a baby Pop X or a Pop X. Probably not a Pop Max, but if that's what you got, that's what you got. Okay, so the 2-rod 2-punch is, you're going to maximize your catch rates by throwing the Karashi, okay, and then pairing that with then throwing your second, a baby Pop X, okay, or a Pop X, okay, for the upper part of the water column. So here's your mid-water column, okay, but if they're more active at the top of that water column and you're not getting bit, you want to switch over to that Pop X, okay, and run it right in the same area, and you'll find oftentimes this didn't get bit, but immediately your Pop X or your baby Pop X got bit. And you can use any topwater. I'm just using Megabass for an example. Because you want to dominate both. You don't want to just run through the middle. The worst thing that you can do is run through an area and just focus on. This is how power guys fumble or stumble, okay? Because they're only covering one part of the water column as they're going down the river, okay? And they're just beating that spinnerbait, and they're only covering one part of the water column, okay? You want to cover multiple parts of the water column when you're breaking down a section, okay? And so what that 2-rod 2-punch does is it allows you to go in there with the Karashi and hit the mid-range of the water column, okay, twitching, hopping, doing however, moving that fast rod tip, okay? But then if there's no joy, coming right back with your second rod and running a topwater bait, okay? And it's amazing how it's a 1-2 punch, because sometimes the mid column will be the bite, and then other times in the same spot, 30 minutes later, the topwater will be the bite. So you want to just kind of like plan that out. So for the Karashi, your primary, to me, it's one of the most versatile baits. Okay, same with Duo. Okay, same size, or Bass Day, same size, like 46S. Like, okay, they're pretty versatile. You can do kind of crazy stuff with it. Okay, it's pretty erratic. So when you're twitching it, depending on what your style is, and so it's very, very effective. Heavy BFS. Again, 80 millimeter, you're going with this. Tidal, you've got a lot of a tidal fishery. You've got, high tide, low tide. Higher tide, I like to go with an 80 millimeter BFS style. Karashi 80 now, but then low tide, switch to a 70 millimeter, 60 millimeter, all the way down to a 46, like I said, with a Bass a Day, and hitting very low tide. Okay. And then we talked about your baby Pop X and your Pop X, or even in your Pop Max, so it's a little bit bigger for that top water function. And then of course the wobber popper. I mean, you can run a wobber popper or Chapo, anything like that that's going to okay, anything like that is what we're talking about here. Okay, you always want to have one of those tied on. So as the morning bite window begins to slow, sun's coming up, it's getting warmer. Maybe those bites have died off. Okay, you got light penetration, there's more pressure, strategy transitions to subsurface stuff. Okay, most people will break out that topwater early in the morning. Maybe they're throwing a frog, maybe they're throwing all their topwater, and then that bite just shuts down. What do? You go for the Karashi. Okay, you go for any BFS style bait. Okay, this phase relies on keeping the bait in the strike zone for experienced periods of time. It's not a spinnerbait presentation. Okay, you're not burning through an area. It's not a chatterbait. You're not burning, okay? You're staying within, for an extended period of time, within that optimum strike zone, okay? You want to draw the fish out. These have a knocker. Watch the Masterclass video on knockers versus rattles, okay? Drop that on the channel. I'll drop that on the channel, and you can check it out early in the newsletter, okay? So you want to do subsurface, and there are a bunch of things you can do with the subsurface, kind of like in that period. A lot of people I transition this. The other thing we've talked about before, part 1. Another quote-unquote BFS, kind of like Finesse style, is your thin Senko, but it doesn't. As somebody sent me a message after I dropped part 1, and they're absolutely correct. It doesn't have to be the traditional Senko style worm. It can be anything that's thin, okay? That's thin. Like, I prefer 5 inches or less, okay, in that, but it can be anything thin. And we're talking about in this part of the day, after that topwater bite has just died, where do you go? A lot of guys spin out. A lot of guys spin out after 10 a.m., okay, because they just don't have a second, a plan B, as we say. So the slow play technique, okay, the slow play, all right. Cast to target. Aim for high percentage cover, docks, laydowns, timber, anything where you perceive, if you were a bass, you would think that area would offer a little bit of security over their heads. Find the rocks with a lot of the undercut, where the water, the current floods, the current has just whittled away at the rock, so the rock kind of like curves, and they can get up underneath the rock, so they've got a rock above their head providing them protection, and they're watching everything else out because they feel safe. The initial sink. Allow the bait to descend at minimum of 3 to 5 feet, depending on your river systems. Obviously, if we're talking about deeper water, it's 5 to 7 feet, okay? But like if you're in 12 foot of water, it's 5 to 7 feet. But if we're only talking about 4 feet of water in a river system, an inland river system, obviously we're not talking about letting this thing get to the bottom, okay? So you got to judge that based on what your river system is. But if you are in 3 or 4 feet of water, you definitely should not be going over 60 millimeters. Okay, go to the Bass Day, go to the Duke, go to the Mega, go to that 46 to 70. Okay, but mostly 60. Okay. The hover, use subtle wrist twitches to keep the bait suspended. So the action is in your wrist and in your fast action tip, okay? The specific depth is critical. It creates a visual trigger capable of calling fish up, okay? You don't have to call them up for that far, right? If you're only in 5 feet of water, you're not calling them up for that far, all right? So a lot of times it's only 1 or 2 twitches, all right? The long pause, allow the bait to sit motionless, okay? It's easier in deeper water, but you gotta gauge that. If you're on a reservoir, it's easier, okay, for sure, okay? But you want to leverage the slow sinking properties of the bait, okay? Because once you twitch it, you're going to get that rise up, and you're going to let it fall again. Natural. Let it naturally fall. This falls very, very natural, okay? By design, all right? With that balance and that system and that, how it falls, okay? How do you how do you master it? Okay, over time, like everything else, it's going to take you a little while, okay? This is basically, the Karashi should be your starter. If you've never BFS, if you bought your first BFS reel and you're going to downsize to 6, 7, 8 pound test, and you're going to get a fast action rod for BFS, this should be your first bait, okay? Learn on the Karashi, and then everything else is going to build from there. So primary retrieve cadences you're going to utilize. Top water burn, you should be familiar with that. Okay, fast, consistent, rich twitching, keeping that bait popping on the surface. Okay, this mimics panicking minnow. Okay, and other fish feeding up on minnow, driving other minnows crazy. Right. The subwalk. Okay, a rhythm underwater walk the dog. Okay, a walk the dog mechanic. Okay, no different than when you're walking that spook or walking that topwater bait. You can walk the Karashi. Okay, very, very subtle. Works. Subsurface twitch, the jerk bait style, pop, pop, pause, pop, pop, pause, pop, pop, pause, right? Same thing we do with the jerk bait, okay? You can do it with the twitch. You can do it with the Karashi. It actually draws the fish out from underneath that boulder, okay, or off of that timber, because they see it. Pop, pop, pause, okay? Dead stick, the dead stick hover, drawing fish from deeper water, twitching the bait, then allowing it to sit motionless in that strike zone. That strike zone should be the predatory corridor, what we call like a channel. Okay, you know that in that channel, they may be on the, but they're near in that, something like that. Like whatever that channel is for them, a transition channel, a natural channel in the river or in your reservoir that you're picking up on your screen or on your graph. Okay, those kinds of things. And of course, you've got the modifications that you can do, and I've listed the modifications in the newsletter piece. There's different techniques you can do with adding a split ring, like a hyperwire split ring, your rod selections. All these things are going to influence really the buoyancy, really, and everything, the action of your bait. So, you don't have to go out and buy a BFS setup and spend that kind of money. You can do it on simple spinning gear or simple bait caster. You just have to figure out your own way. A lot of times I draw, and so when I have these baits, so I'm pulling my line. Same as if I'm fly fishing, right? I'm pulling my line to get a different action using the line pull over my tip. If I don't have a fast tip rod on, if I got a MH, a medium heavy rod, because I was throwing the jigs or whatever like that, I like those rods. I could still do some modified techniques and throw the Karashi on or any BFS bait on, and the actual rod may not really be predicated for BFS, but you can still do some things. When you got spinning gear, you can do some things. For true. I mean, obviously your bait caster can provide you a little bit too. So line specifications, we talked about that in part 1. Obviously, you have 6, 7, 8 pound test. I prefer Daiwa line, P line. I prefer P line top water for a lot of stuff. I know that sounds crazy, but the buoyancy of the P water top water line will actually keep your baits, especially these small baits, higher in the water column. So it makes them more buoyant because the line is more buoyant. Okay, those people that are throwing braid, that are kind of transitioning using braid for everything, or using a braid or a fluoro and a fluoro, then a braid, like That's going to be a different thing, okay? Braid is not going to give you the buoyancy, okay? So just keep that in mind. 610 to 7s, 7-1, 610, 7-1. Obviously, you can go high-end Megabass Destroyer. Reels, you can go, Shimano, Daiwa. They've got the new BFS lines. All the real manufacturers now have BFS. So you want wrist action precision. You're looking for maximum sensitivity, weight reduction, buoyancy in your line, fast action tip on your rod. That's really what you want. And just like manage your expectation, okay? That's really what we're talking about. Like come in with an open mentality when you start with a Karashi or any BFS bait that you may not be used to doing, and just come into it with an open mindset, right? Because it's going to take a little bit of time for you to get command of it. But if you fished a jerkbait before, if you fished those kinds of, the application is very, very similar. If you're used to twitching any kind of bait, you can make the Karashi work for you, especially in high pressured situations. Okay, that's really what it is prone for. You can start with something else in the early morning. Start with your favorite big topwater. Start with your chatterbait. Burn and hop, boom. And that sun comes up when you get that 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Have a plan B. Okay, and I think if you go with a Karashi or a Bass Day or a Duo, something like that in this BFS range, you're going to see your catch rates throughout the day. You'll fill your limit out. If you didn't get your limit in the morning, you're going to fill your limit out by making this simple Plan B switch with the Karashi. All right, so that's a Karashi paradox. Again, check out the newsletter, Smallmouth. Army.substack.com. If you ever have any questions or you have any problems sourcing any of the Karashi, you can send me a message. You can get the Karashi and all the Megabass baits for 15% off. It's not what you're going to find at the retail stores, but with the Smalley Chaser code, you can get 15% off, and we'll get you some of these. We'll get you some of these Karashis. Or any of the Megabass, Baby Pop Baby Pop X, Pop X that I've talked about in these videos, and in a newsletter, and pretty soon coming up, you're going to be able to just click inside the newsletter and go right to purchase any of the baits inside the newsletter. So it's going to be a lot easier function than having to, send me an email or message me and all that stuff. It'll be automatic. So we're really looking forward to that. Again, appreciate you guys. This was the Karashi Paradox Masterclass. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to the newsletter if you want these updates. We're going to do a lot more of these each week. We're going to try and drop 2 a week for the masterclass as we move in from spring to summer and then into fall. Keep guys coming along, on those rainy days, or if you're in this video series is for the guys in the car, they can just listen to it like it's on Spotify or something, or Apple, you know what I mean? Like they can just listen to it when they're driving around town or on their way to the next event. But if you really want to get into it, you want to get in the newsletter. And you want to be able to just follow along, see the graphics, infographics, the techniques, the line ties, the different size. I think we just dropped the when to throw the Big M 2.0 versus the Megabass 4.0. When should you throw each of those? Has been dropped on the newsletter. I've got some great feedback on that. The Megabass Big M is not really a widely used bait. Like the Karashi, because no one's really been out talking about it. You know what I mean? But it's crazy sick, and the patterns are freaking awesome for your fisheries, especially if you're fishing like a really deep highland reservoir, or you're dealing a reservoir with deeper water. Big M's, man, Big M's are great crankbaits, man. But everybody talks about the S crank. Everybody talks about, the level crank. Everybody talks about the square bill kind of crankbaits more so than they do the other style build crankbaits. So check that out. All right, guys, I appreciate you. Again, this is the Karashi Sakura Illusion from the Respect series from Megabass. But the Karashi comes in about 16, I think 12 to 16 different colors when you factor in the different lines. Tactical Bassin also has 4, I believe, in special, like Juvie Gill and special colors. Okay, cover that in the newsletter. Special colors, I think they have a white python or a bone, I think. They have their own special colors with Megabass, too, that are available on top of the standard 70 and, millimeter, and then obviously the Karashi 80 JDM colors, and then the Karashi 80 SW okay, which is the Karashi 80 saltwater version. Okay, a bunch of killer colors there. All right, guys, I appreciate all of you. Please like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you next time.